Yes. Hello, hello. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to the sixth installment of the Secure Cloudcast. I'm Michael Foster, one of your hosts for the day. I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Kim.
Hello.
Kim, why don't you introduce yourself? Let the people know what we're talking about today.
Hey, everybody. So, you know me if you come. If you don't, you don't. So, I'm a security product marketer here at Red Hat. And today we're going to be talking about zero trust and how it relates to the secure supply chain and do some updates around ACS as well as our current presence at the Cloud Native Security Con in Seattle.
Yeah, very exciting. Kirsten Newcomer is joining us in a little bit. She's in the green room right now. I can see her watching us in the background there. But yeah, exciting news. So ACS, our Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security 3.74 is out. Came out Monday. If you see the little where is it? Up here, little QR code. You can scan there,
Sure.
check out the release notes. I want to talk a little bit about some two new features that we have coming up. And of course, big changes in 4.0 coming out in April-ish. We'll let you know a little bit more on the timeline next month when we have the show. We'll get down into the details about what's going to change. But yeah, 4.0, so somewhat of a big change. Want to give you all of the details to make that possible so that you don't get stuck on anything, especially for our open source users. We know that sometimes you're a little bit more in the dark, not have that support, but we try to help you out. Anyway, so 3.74 being out, two big things that I really love. One, network policy. The network graph is getting a huge upgrade/update. So for me and Boaz, if you're watching this, please don't send me a mean message. You've done a great job. It looks a lot better. It's a lot just more readable. The visuals are a lot better. The functionality really hasn't changed too much. So you still get that great network policy simulator, all that shift left goodness with the CLI and the command line integration with MP Guard. So that's all there. It's prettier. So new year, new network graph. I think it's a great job, and it will also translate really well into the scaling of the cloud service. So I think that's awesome. The second part is the collections feature. So, coming from StackRox and moving into Red Hat, we've also had to deal with, let's say, bigger use cases where there's extremely large clusters. And sometimes managing policies at that scale is extremely difficult, as I'm sure anybody that deals with policy and security is aware. And so we came up with collections. So, grouping collections, being able to apply them as new groups, new clusters come in automatically, as labels get added, being able to sort by exact labels, by some wildcards. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you implement that. So I think it's a really cool policy. You will have to use the new database. So Postgres upgrade that is in tech preview, but as part of the 4.0 migration, it's going to be recommended to get that collections feature. And again, that's just going to help you scale. It's going to open up a lot of new avenues, especially cloud service integrating and just being able to automatically apply those policies. So let us know what you think. Again, I will actually change the QR code for you if you want. All of these features are available open source as well. So if you want to test out StackRox for free, let us know what you think in the Slack channel about the network graph changes and the collections feature. We'd love to hear from you. We're looking for feedback before we get to 4.0. So now's your chance to weigh in. All right, I'm out of breath now, Kim. What else do we have on the docket before we got Kirsten?
Well, I was
Running to
hoping
join
that
us?
we could talk a little bit more about the Cloud Native Security Con show, but I think you and Kirsten were both there. So you might have some good insight on what was there and what you saw and what the hot topics were for the community.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, this will be a good segue. I'll let say my spiel, and then I'll introduce Kirsten, and she can come in and tell me where I was wrong. I think that's a good segue. Overall, I thought it was a very pointed event. I thought the conversation was really good. A lot of security expertise in one area, which meant that you didn't have to do any small talk. People were very, hey, what's this do? Why are you doing this? What's the market for this? Who asked for this? Everybody wanted to know use cases. And I found one of the biggest, let's say, changes from KubeCon is just the sort of grouping of security features. Everybody wanted to know if your platform could do everything.
Yeah.
It just seemed like it was never, it's not the open source, let's say, landscape that it was 3 or 4 years ago when we started talking about security and the niche use cases. Now you have to be a whole cloud workload protection platform, or they want observability in their security platform to say, oh, there's memory changes. Why can't my security platform pick this up? So I think there's a lot of consolidation that's happening. People are trying to pick up on some efficiencies. That was a general trend I saw. I thought that the discussions were really Awesome. Man, overall, it was pretty nice week in Seattle. I had no complaints. Had some great seafood.
Yeah. They
And
do.
I'm looking forward to the next one. Yeah, next year. It's I wish
Yeah.
you could have joined us, but
I know. Sad story. Next time.
yeah. And we
Yeah.
got some people live in the chat. If you have any questions about Cloud Native Security
Oh,
Con, ACS 3.74 or Zero Trust with Kirsten Newcomer, or the conversation we're going to be having, just throw it in the chat and we'll answer them live for you. But I think without further ado, Kim, you want to do the honors?
sure. Kirsten, newcomer, could you please join?
Bringing you in.
How are you?
Hey,
Yeah.
so good. I don't have to do anything to join. You guys press the
That's
magic
true.
button, right?
Yeah.
So it's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks again for coming on. This is your
Sure
second time
thing.
on the show. I remember you
True.
kind of kicked it off talking about supply chain last year. Wanted to bring you on with a more controversial topic, zero trust in supply chain. What's changed over the last 6 months. But before we get into that, I want to get your thoughts on Cloud Native Security Con, what you're seeing in the market, your users,
Yeah,
Red Hat in general.
sure. Absolutely. I would never tell you you were wrong, Mike. No, if it was appropriate, but it's not at this time. You absolutely nailed it. One of the things I really appreciated, for folks who don't know, right, Cloud Native Security Con used to be co-located with KubeCon, and it would be a 2-day event, kind of, they call them 0-day events, right, where you start ahead of the KubeCon conference. Um, and that was useful, but we were limited to, in many cases, one room, one track. I think what was nice about it was, man, a lot of people go to KubeCon, so there's breadth. What I really appreciated about it being its own conference was what you said earlier: nice tight focus on security, and we were able to do so much more with it being its own conference and cover so much more ground. So supply chain security was a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a couple of years now, really ever since the SolarWinds hack. And remains a hot topic. Many organizations, including Red Hat, out there figuring out ways to help improve supply chain security. Lots of work in the upstream community as well. For example, Luke Hines from Red Hat founded the SigStore community. You can find it at sigstore.dev. And that's really grown rapidly and quickly, making it easier. Kind of the goal of that is, how do I integrate attestation processes and policies into a CI/CD pipeline? Because typical processes in that space really don't lend themselves well, or traditional ones don't lend themselves well to a pipeline. But it was a great event. I'm hoping anybody in our audience who's interested in kube and container security, keep an eye out for when the next one is happening.
And I believe all the sessions are recorded and online.
Yes.
If people want to check out the technical ones.
Yep, they're on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I know we had a hatter there. Michael Peters had a great, well-attended talk as well.
Yeah, that was an awesome talk.
Yeah, so a lot of technical knowledge being shared. So you were on 6 months ago. I think almost probably half the talks at Cloud Security Con had some sort of supply chain theme to it. What do you see as still the big challenge in adoption? Is it still too bleeding edge? Do customers just not have the bandwidth? What do you see as some of the big challenges for supply chain security?
I think a lot of it is that CI/CD processes are complex. There are a lot of moving parts, and organizations have invested a lot in the tooling that they're using today. They may have been using that tooling for 5 years. They may not be ready to migrate. Not every organization centralizes their CI/CD process. In fact, so supply chain in particular, when we're talking about building the supply chain for building a custom application, that often organizations kind of delegate decisions around how to manage that to the app dev teams. They're the ones who are living with it. Now, there's been a shift to DevOps, but it's still sort of the same challenge, right? There are so many different tools that need to be integrated into a CI/CD process, a tool chain, to add security capabilities into that supply chain, that creates a challenge too. Which are the right tools? What's the point? Am I buying best of breed point tools? Am I looking for an overall solution? Do I have traditional apps with traditional architectures? Do I want to use a Kube native pipeline like Tecton? What are the tools that work in each of those environments? Can I have commonality in my security tooling across those environments or not? And kind of, so we're dealing with a lot of change. And that means we're talking about people, process, and technology, and across multiple groups. And also, right, sort of the starting point for supply chain security is how do you trust the content that you're pulling down from external sources into your custom app, into your supply chain for your custom app? How do you evaluate that? How do you assess that? Do you have the processes in place? So it's just tons of moving parts, and a lot of new things showing up in the community to take advantage of. But you have to figure out how those new things require new tooling and new processes.
Yeah. And Mike was specifically talking about how one of I would say sort of like the trends or common themes they were discussing at the show was the idea of having like a platform approach or approach where they had several different options, in one solution. So I'm wondering, like, do you think that's kind of to help with the supply chain security so they don't have all these little pieces and a lot of different areas?
Yeah, definitely that can make things easier, right? So there are solutions out there. There are platforms like GitLab, kind of where it's sort of all in one. There are offerings from cloud providers, again, where you kind of can leverage all in one. A challenge with that approach can be that I've already got processes and tooling that I'm using today, and changing my CI/CD processes can have a significant impact on my delivery of the applications that the business relies on. And so it's really not just about flipping a switch. I can't just move to a new integrated platform. I really have to evaluate, does it support all the policies that are important to me as an organization, to my organization? Do I need to customize things? I need to learn the tooling. So a lot of value in that, but it's not the only approach, right? And sometimes a more incremental approach can actually be easier for an organization, where they can work with an existing CI/CD tool set, but maybe start adding in some new capabilities that they hadn't included before, such as, signing the content that moves through that pipeline. That's, again, where a project like SigStore comes in. People often have the ambition to sign content that moves through the pipeline, but it's never been easy to do. So even then, I have new tooling to adopt. I have to think, I have to learn that tooling, but it's maybe an incremental approach. And so kind of our experience in having delivered, Kubernetes-based OpenShift for over 10 years now. I feel like I'm way undercounting that. But that we see organizations who want to use their existing pipeline, update it incrementally. Other organizations who are willing to adopt something new, like, again, Tecton, which allows you to manage your pipeline as code. And there are a ton of Tecton tasks out there on the hub, on the Tecton hub, so that you can kind of come and put things together, pre-built pieces. But there's no real one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah. Before you get into zero trust, you mentioned, use cases and doing it slowly versus having something to model it against. How much does something like a validated pattern help with that process, right? Like, it's very hard for us to recommend and say, this is the way to do it. At the same time, we can have an approach and be slightly opinionated, right?
Absolutely. So if I'm thinking specifically about building applications for Kubernetes with a Kubernetes pipeline, in fact, we have we have what we call a pattern, a validated pattern available. It's out on GitHub. We can share the link. If you're using OpenShift Platform Plus, you can use this code to deploy all the parts of OpenShift Platform Plus with an instantiated, opinionated Tecton pipeline with integrated security gates. Now, not everything in this pipeline comes from Red Hat, because we don't do everything that you need to do today in a secure supply chain. So, for example, the pattern is built with an integration with Sonatype Nexus that helps produce an SBOM. You could swap out Sonatype Nexus for JFrog Artifactory if that's the repository you use, right? Or if you wanted to use a different open source tool for SBOMs or whatever you use. Integrations with partners for static security analysis are also in there. So, but absolutely, that's an opinionated solution set. And if you did nothing else but look at what are the gates, what are the kinds of things I should be doing, it does provide a pattern that could be followed. So easier if you're using Tecton, boom, instantiated with all the gates in place. But you can still go take a look. And if you've got a kube cluster, go instantiate that pipeline and learn from it.
And I actually found the article that William Henry and Johnny Rickard created about how to architect a multi-cluster pattern using the DevSecOps validated pattern. So go ahead and check that out. It's in the chat for you. All right, now I think on to well, at least it's controversial for me because I personally don't like the term zero trust. So I kind of want to hear your take on it.
Yeah.
See if anybody in the chat has any opinions on the term zero trust as well. But, how much does zero trust play into the securing the supply chain? Is it something where you should come in with, hard gates? Is it better to kind of implement the tools first and then see where there is a give and take with developers? Anyways, it's a broad question. I'll let you take it.
No, they're great. Those are great questions. I also have struggled with the phrase zero trust simply because it can be used to mean so many different things. And in many cases, you see it a lot in marketing content, and you kind of need to go, so what do you mean when you say zero trust? And what do you mean when you say zero trust, right? So let me start with how I think about it, and also how Red Hat thinks about this, right? So we're really focusing on, when I talk, so there's the traditional definition, right? That more traditional security models pre-cloud assumed that as long as you protected the perimeter, you were good, that users within that protected perimeter were trusted, and you didn't need to focus heavily on them. That assumption, that perimeter assumption was kind of shown to be false with the SolarWinds attack. And so SolarWinds themselves have worked hard to apply zero trust principles to their supply chain. They did a great talk at Cloud Native Security Con at KubeCon LA a couple of years ago about how they did that. And so let me circle back to, again, what I mean by those zero trust principles. I mean that everyone needs to authenticate. Identity of individuals matters. Identity of tooling matters also. Identity for APIs and what I'm using, anything that's automated. Integrity matters, right? As content moves through the system, I want to be sure that I can measure the integrity of that content, that it hasn't changed when I don't expect it to change. This was a big element for SolarWinds in revamping their supply chain and their pipeline. And then isolation matters, right? How can I ensure that users and systems only have access to the elements that they should have access to, so that I'm preventing lateral attacks, lateral movement, and really enforcing separation of concerns appropriately. And so when that comes to the supply chain, that means that I want to be able to, when it comes to integrity, I want to be able to attest that the tasks in my supply chain, my CI/CD pipeline, have not changed. I want to be able to attest that the integrity of the content hasn't changed when I don't expect it to change. So if I'm pulling down content from external sources, that content should be signed, and I should be able to verify that signature when I pull it down so that I know that nothing got tampered with in between. Now, of course, I'm including that with my custom content. So I'm going to do a build. As the output of that build, then I want to sign the output of that build at the appropriate stage as well to be sure that I can track that nothing has changed, again, that I didn't expect to change. I'm deploying content to Kubernetes. When I do that, I'm deploying an image, a pod. I have configuration data that also gets deployed. I want to be sure my YAML hasn't been tampered with, right? I want to sign my YAML. And when I deploy, I want to verify signatures on container images and signatures on my YAML. So these are some of the integrity elements that we can look at. And then authentication, right? That's all about ensuring that only the users and systems that I approve for access to this pipeline have access. What I loved about what SolarWinds did, and they did this with a Tecton pipeline, is they had their main pipeline, their primary pipeline, and they replicated every step in that pipeline in an automated fashion. And then they checked that the output of every step was the same. So that they, man, and great stuff. It's a really great talk. And then they use Tecton chains to sign the tasks in their pipeline. But they really are doing zero trust for their supply chain, understandably.
Yeah,
Oh,
no kidding. It's pretty impressive. I remember attending a topic about reproducible builds as well. Just everything
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
point where you can reproduce it. If I give it to you, you can do the same thing. You get the same hash, so you know nothing's been tampered with. I think that capability will be extremely useful. So, do you think that has more relevance in the cloud, or somebody that's in a detached on-prem environment, they should also be doing the same sort of signing and attestation? Do you think there's any difference between the
yeah.
models?
So that sort of comes back to kind of where we started with zero trust, right? Zero trust is, how much am I going to trust the people who work in my company? How much do I trust that I've protected my perimeter and that's sufficient? But it's not just the people who work there in my perimeter. It's like there are so many new attack vectors showing up on a regular basis, so many new vulnerabilities being discovered that, you know, even if I've protected my perimeter, that doesn't guarantee that something won't show up 2 weeks from now that allows an attacker to breach that perimeter, right?
Hmm.
So ideally, you would really be ensuring at minimum authentication, managing identity, managing integrity, on premises and in the cloud. You might decide that isolation is a little bit more important to you in the cloud. Maybe you feel like you have less control over that infrastructure. And so isolation is a funny thing, right? Because it's sort of like we think of that for runtime environments mostly, but your pipeline is a runtime environment in some ways, right? It is doing things, it is building, it is creating content. And so, you want to be using appropriate access controls, and you want to be sure that that running pipeline is in an environment where it's not going to be tampered with. So I would say, the better part of valor is to use both, to do the same approach, whether it's a SaaS offering, a SaaS pipeline that you're running in the cloud, or an on-premises pipeline. But I think also back to the beginning of our conversation, it takes time to make adjustments. So look for things look for the easy adds, think about a phased approach, and figure out how can you get there from here. SBOMs is another really interesting example. There are a lot of tools that organizations are using today that'll output SBOMs. There's also open source tooling. SBOMs have been software bill of materials. they've been a thing for well over 10 years, but they have sudden prominence now. And that's another way to verify that what you've got is what you expect, right? Did my bill of materials change from this stage in the pipeline to the next stage in the pipeline? So if you're not ready to adopt SigStore and do signing in your pipeline, look for a tool like SIFT and to produce SBOMs, and kind of track those through your pipeline.
So you mentioned SBOMs have been around for 10 plus years ish. What do you think has been the main driver in adoption, and why did it take so long?
Yeah, so it's funny. The initial kind of focus on SBOMs came out of organizations who really needed to ensure that they were complying with open source license terms. So a lot of so these bill of materials would be created by companies like Black Duck, other competitors in that space. Full disclosure, I worked at Black Duck for 7 years. Prior to coming to Red Hat, I've been at Red Hat for 7 years now. So in fact, SBOMs are older than 10 years. But the SPDX standard, which is now an ISO standard, probably is about 10 years old. And so it sort of started primarily with Linux distributions, with organizations that were doing embedded software. They needed to really ensure that they had appropriate open source license compliance. And to do that, you needed your bill of materials of your software packages and the licenses associated with that. And then from there, you've got that list anyway. Well, gosh, I can use that list to get more information about vulnerabilities associated with those packages. So the security element started emerging, probably about 10 years ago. But you saw these tools that were originally developed for license compliance starting to be used for the same approach being used for vulnerability analysis, right? I know how to identify open source components. I can pull license data for those. The popularity of the phrase SBOM, though, that really ties back to more recent activity where there's in the States, the executive order after the SolarWinds supply chain attack. Everybody needs to, if you are providing software to the US government, you have to provide a software bill of materials for what you're providing. So I think that executive order just, really popped the space.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Emmy Idea had a great talk at Cloud Security Con
Yeah.
and said it very succinctly. I think a lot of people look at security like it's insurance, something to have, nice to have, but sort of a cost sink, I think. But when it's phrased like, without it, you're not even going to have access to any of these markets, right? If you don't have these things,
Yeah.
I think that's kind of eye opening. It's just like, if you're going to do business with the federal government, you have to have these things in 3 years. I think, a lot of people, let's say, shift their strategy, right? So overall, do you see that just continuing? I know the federal government doing it. It's kind of a crystal ball question. But, I've talking with most vendors, I think, most people are building SBOM verification checks, some sort of visualization into their platforms, whether it's like observability tools, but most security tools are starting to do that. Are you seeing this as going to be like a sticking point, a must have moving forward in the next decade?
Oh, yeah. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, everybody's going to be producing software bill of materials. I don't think it's going to take us as long to get there as 5 years. And you talked earlier about what we're starting to see about organizations at CNCF SecurityCon, end users wanting to have to move away from single point solutions, security solutions, to broader ones. That's going to be an interesting angle because I think that speaks also to who's the buyer and who's the end user. And so to tie this to software bill of materials, that content to get the most accurate software bill of materials is going to come when you are analyzing source code. The second most accurate is going to be when you're analyzing a binary. And then once I send a bill of materials to my consumer, my end user, I can leverage that metadata for a whole bunch of things. But to produce that, the user who's going to create an SBOM, they're either in the app dev team, they might be also, again, kind of on the DevOps team. I'm pulling content down. I'm going to, do I want to produce my own SBOM when I pull that down, or do I expect it to be there so that I consume it? If it's there, how do I verify it? Do I need to verify it? Can I trust it? It's come from a third party. The answer to that is going to depend on what you're doing with the content. If you're just using it as is, trusting it, and it's been signed, and you can verify that it hasn't been tampered with, that could be sufficient. If you are using the source code and modifying that source code, that's a whole nother thing. You need to produce a software bill of materials that matches what your output is. And I think that, again, because of the mandate from the federal government, obviously some organizations will move more slowly than others, but the tools are there. And people may not even realize in some cases that they have the tools. Again, a vulnerability scanner is going to give you a list of packages. That's a software bill of material, right? So a lot of people actually have information already available. It's just not output in the most popular format. It's the two most popular, SPDX, Software Package Data Exchange, and Cyclone DX, Cyclone Data Exchange, are probably the two most popular formats right now. It's not that hard to update that. But if I circle back to the consolidation that you and I both kind of have been hearing in the market, security teams are interested in buying governance and risk management solutions that cover a broad range of things, especially as their companies are moving workloads to the cloud, right? So they want cloud security posture management. They want cloud identity and entitlement management. They maybe want that combined with Kubernetes security, identity, and that's broad. That's entitlement, that's, RBAC, authentication, runtime behavioral analysis. But those aren't the folks who who use, I shouldn't say buy, those aren't the folks who use the security tools that need to be in that CI/CD pipeline. And so I think there's going to be this interesting tension also between where's the budget, who's the buyer, who's the end user. And as we kind of think about DevSecOps, right, how do we ensure that tooling and data that's useful to the DevOps team can be fed into the SecOps team for their consumption and for them to leverage for policies as well. So I think there's this interesting tension with the consolidation. I don't know which way it's going to go.
Yeah. I mean, I've felt some of that tension on some email threads sometimes when you talk about developers and security teams and what they expect their tools to do. I think developers, if they need any sort of security information, it is the vulnerabilities and can I update it just with a package fix? If I just upgrade to the newest version, is that going to fix it? If yes, okay, fine, easy to do. But then you get in these conversations, some security teams say, oh, malware scanning. I want, sort of like 20 years old practices in containers in Kubernetes in the cloud with things that are stateless. They're not even touching any data really. And there's a big disconnect between, I think, with what the developer needs to get going and to limit their threats and then what the security team expects. And these cloud platforms kind of package it all as one, but then there's a huge gap in between that never really gets addressed, right? So it's this tension of how do you make the shift and do it in a way where everybody's happy? I don't know if you've seen a couple of use cases. It's always it's just a challenge when picking solutions, and I think there's a reason why the security platforms want to be a catch-all so they can market it. But also sometimes you get to these platforms and it's not really useful it's not as useful as you might have thought, or it requires like you to install Istio or something like that. Like if you want zero trust networking and layer 7 network protocols and limiting and all that stuff, you need something that's pretty heavy duty to do that, right? So it's always this challenge between actual applicability that's useful and what security and zero trust is. I don't know. It's a tough
Well,
line to walk, but
yeah, and I think there's the tension again, it's back to people, process, and technologies, right? So why did containers become so popular? Because they gave more control to the developers. I package my system dependencies with my application code. I don't have to rely on the ops team to get that VM with my system dependencies up and running before I can deploy my app. I can package everything together and manage it. And when you think about Kubernetes security, there's some of that same philosophy being applied, right? To your point about Istio, great, powerful tool for ensuring that pod to pod communication is encrypted, not designed for a network security person, really designed for the app dev team to manage policies for the communication policies for their microservices. And so now, how does the network security team understand what the app dev team is doing, and so that they can provide guidance and, kind of audit, right? Audit is really important in the world. Observability, you mentioned it earlier. Audit is part of observability, right? So things like investing in network observability, I think, start to move us, and this is something that we've added in OpenShift recently. Don't remember the upstream project name. It's something that's available in StackRox and in ACS. Is that ability to view the active communications between pods compared to what's allowed by kube network policies, right? I think where we have to get to is the app dev team are the folks who know what communications their microservices need. They need some control. The security teams need observability and auditability. And how do we help? And that's what's going to kind of bridge these two. But that is a big change for people,
Yeah.
right? So just like the system dependencies are now in the container image, well, hey, we have to provide more security capabilities to the app dev team. How does the security team still have some oversight?
Yeah.
And that's where things like StackRox come in, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's let's say there's a tough approach to starting new projects, I think, too, at some of these companies, where if you give a developer, you say, hey, I want you to containerize this, and you're the greenfield one, well, you don't want to get 6 months down the line, and then down the line, then security comes in and says you have too many vulnerabilities, but maybe they're all low and medium, right? They're not even, high and critical and important vulnerabilities. So there's a tough line between the two. Yeah, MJ says network policy ? I think when you're talking about sort of the gap between security and dev teams, network policies is definitely one of them, because I know there's a lot of security teams that don't want to go into any sort of container Kubernetes security solution to deal with network policies. So I know. I mean, I think that's kind of what our PMs are working on with ACS in terms of the functionality of the network graph, right?
Absolutely. And MJ, feel free to clarify for us if there's more. But so I'm talking about, we're talking about Kubernetes network policies, as well as service mesh policies, both of which can be used, right, to codify what services are allowed to talk to what other services, or what pods are allowed to talk to what other pods within a Kubernetes cluster. And with service mesh, you can do that between clusters as well, right? You're not just limited to a cluster. But there have not been, this is actually something in progress upstream. It's two things. My brain is going on two different tracks. There's this new thing coming for Kube, admin network policies, where a cluster admin will be able to set certain network policies that the project admin or the namespace admin won't be able to modify. But to your point in StackRox, right? Because this is such a confusing thing, right? Again, defining network policies, kube network policies is not easy. You have to write it in YAML. It's somewhat involved. We've been working to invest in providing automation that can be used in the CI/CD pipeline to recommend a network policy that's appropriate for the app that's being built, so that the developer gets that information. Because honestly, not every app dev, individual application developer is going to be great at writing those network policies either, right? And we know that the network security folks aren't reading YAML or writing YAML, so generally they're not going to do it. So we can auto-generate these policies, and over time, this is work in progress, we'll also be able to compare that to system policies defined in StackRox Central, where that system policy sort of codifies what does the security team think is an acceptable set of network policies to run on the cluster. For example, do they only want pods to be able to talk to each other if they're in the same namespace? Or is it okay for them to talk across namespaces? And then you can compare that generated network policy with the system network policy, the ACS policy for network policies, and find out, the development team can find out ahead of time whether they're going to meet those requirements or not. So you can have a conversation between those two teams before you even get to deployment time. But it is an area, right? So there's still lots of organizations that have network security teams who specialize in this, and they think about IP addresses and firewalls, and YAML and clusters and nodes and pods are not necessarily things that are on their radar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think some things I've noticed with ACS that we've been releasing really seem to be very much focused on a way for you to be able to dig into certain things and be able to have conversations from two groups that may speak different languages, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like we've done a lot of things in that recently with the solution to help with that communication.
Yeah.
And
I think that's always been part of the intent, right? To out of the box have policies, security policies that meet security best practices in a Kubernetes native way, but are articulated. If you're looking at the StackRox dashboard or the policies themselves, they're articulated in a way that makes sense to a security person. And they can be mapped to MITRE ATT&CK frameworks in many ways, which is also something a security team is aware of. But they're implemented in a Kubernetes native way. And they provide traceability between system processes, or at least the data StackRox collects, traceability between system processes and Kubernetes objects in a way that, again, is going to help a security team figure out who to talk to and what they need to talk to those teams about.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think the enforcement mechanism is the sort of the end of the line, but it's super important, right? I mean, if your developer needs to make a change to configuration and then you have to go into SCCs or something like that on a host, that workflow is kind of broken, right? It's why we have, I'm blanking on the new operator that we released.
The security
SCC profile operator, right?
Security profile operator, which actually is about SE Linux and SecComp. So
and AppArmor too. I think it's a whole thing, right?
Yeah, well, so the cluster admin can manage security context constraints on OpenShift, which is comparable to upstream kube pod security policies. Those kind of standalone. SCCs are an admission controller plugin that you can use. For example, by default on OpenShift, a privileged workload cannot be deployed to a worker node by a regular user because of the way SCCs are configured. Now, those are complicated, and OpenShift has an out-of-the-box 7 or 8 SCCs that allow you to kind of pick from different scenarios, because sometimes you need privileged workloads. But the cool thing about the security profile operator, the thing I love, is that, and then we'll talk pod security admission too, which is even more interesting. When you need to allow privileges to a workload, you also want to mitigate as much as possible back to that zero trust. So, for example, and pod security admission is the new upstream, thing that replaces pod security policies. But there are only 3 profiles. There's baseline, there's restricted, baseline, and privileged.
3 default profiles, right?
3 default profiles, and you can't build any more. If you want to do something more complicated, you use a tool outside of Kubernetes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so the security profile operator says, okay, I've got to deploy a privileged workload. It needs a Linux capability, perhaps like netadmin, which containerized network functions often need. Okay, but I don't want netadmin. That Linux capability gives you a lot of stuff. And if I want to constrain it further to just what this app needs, I can use some seccomp, secure computing profiles. But defining those and deploying those are a pain in the butt, as you just said, right? Deploying that, it has to be deployed to the node that the workload is going to run on. You have to figure out how to, you have to associate it with the workload. You can do that with an SCC. How do you, but you have to get custom SCC defined. You have to do, so the security profile operator helps you manage all of that. The tool that you can use to help define your custom seccomp profile or a custom SE Linux profile is called UDISA and is available in RHEL or in Upstream. So you kind of do that definition work earlier in the process. Security profile operators help you deploy it so that you've got those mitigating controls in place. It's really nice to see how can we, and honestly, the Kube community only recently supported having, with pod security admission, having seccomp profiles on by default. Am I geeking out here? Sorry.
I love it.
This is the speaking. This is the space. Geek all you want.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you see the container forensic capabilities as well that are in alpha and 1.25?
That is awesome. Yeah, we are actually going to be, I can't tell you the number of security teams I've talked to who want that capability, right? So you're going to be able to actually, without the running container knowing, do a copy of that, of a stateful copy of that running container called a checkpoint, right? It's being checkpointed. And then that checkpoint can be restored in another environment, a sandboxed environment, and analyzed. So we will finally have the kind of forensic tools for containers that security teams have been used to having for traditional apps, right? That is a wicked cool thing.
Really it is cool. It also, it only took 8 years for containers to start to mimic virtual machines again, right? We're back where we started, but
well, there's still Kata containers, right? You can have you can run your container in a micro VM, or KubeVirt, you can run a VM in a pod. So it is interesting. Yeah.
It just seems like we built it for the developers, and then we have to slowly drag people along with the typical workflows to say, like, yes, we have the same tooling that you're used to. Come to come.
Yes. Yeah. So fair enough.
But it is a really cool feature. That's alpha and Kubernetes 1.2.5. So
correct.
Probably stable by the end of the year, hopefully. So you'll probably see it in the next version, or at least in tech preview, I think, and probably some of the newer versions of OpenShift.
Yeah, I would expect that, I'm hoping it'll be beta in 1.2.6, and typically once something goes beta and Upstream, we're able to have it as either dev preview or tech preview in OpenShift. And then I'm really looking forward to what we can do with that with StackRox.
And
could be some cool stuff.
That's why I think the enforcement mechanism and being able to use the Kubernetes native controls also makes it, say, easier on the engineering team, because when Kubernetes builds this in, we could just say, okay, well, we're used to working with Kubernetes API. Let's do the same thing.
Right. And you don't need to buy a point tool.
Yeah. Right. And so I think it's sort of the open source capabilities of Red Hat contributes to Kubernetes. Kubernetes makes it so that we have these controls, and then you're able to pick up on this and all the other open source tools. It just speeds up that development so much quicker too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's awesome. Anything, so we're coming up on the hour. Is there any last things you want to hit on? Any links you want to direct people to, Kirsten? We'll have you back again for the yearly summary. Like when we hit a year of the show, we'll bring you back.
Sure. Of course. Well,
beginning, I think maybe just worth mentioning that Red Hat Summit is coming up in May. And there will definitely be some cool security announcements. I think I imagine we've talked on this show before about offering Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security as a cloud service. So that's currently in field trial, and we'll have more to say about where that is at Summit. There's also this really cool solution that we've been working on about supply chain security as a service that we'll be talking about more at Summit. So keep your ears peeled.
Very exciting.
Yeah, super exciting. When are the dates for Summit exactly?
Oh gosh, I always have to go look. It's in May. It's in Boston. Red Hat.
Boston in May. That was great.
Summit 2023. Okay. And May 23rd through 25th.
And that's typically Seaport area, right?
Yes, it'll. I imagine will be at the. I don't know for sure, but I imagine at the Boston Convention Center, and Summit this year will also include Ansible Fest for all those folks who are interested in Ansible.
That's awesome. So, I mean, we got some good seafood in Seattle last month at Cloud Security Con.
That's right.
Hopefully we get to do it again at Red Hat Summit. That's awesome. Kirsten Newcomer, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for hosting.
It was awesome to chat with you. Anyways, I'm Mike Foster. I'll see you next month, joined by my lovely co-host, Kim Carlos. Kim, sign us off.
All right. Hasta la pasta, and we will see you next month.
Take care.
Bye.